Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
In my youth, I very often had trouble sleeping. I would spend nights lying awake in my bed staring at an empty white ceiling with my eyes wide open and my mind overcome with an anarchic jumble of thoughts, though I suppose this was probably favorable over the horrible night terrors I experienced in my early childhood. Unfortunately, the insomnia made my college years far more difficult, as I found it troublesome to focus on my studies with the mental strain of lacking sleep decimating my attention span. I began going on walks. My university was very much in nature, so it was always a nice stroll through the trees. Sometimes, though, I'd get needlessly frustrated in my sleeplessness by the obnoxious and often very drunk college kids whom I would pass, so I began diverting my path to the numerous hiking trails in my area. It was liberating, the feeling of freedom from everything, a kind of comfortable solitude. Sometimes I wouldn't return home until sunup. Eventually, I discovered a secluded, hidden spot just off of one of the trails. I started bringing a blanket and a snack when I went there, and sometimes I found that I could actually sleep when I was there. As a result, I become more well-rested in my everyday life. Focusing became easier. I gained a healthy appetite, and I was generally happier in life. It was amazing. For a while. I write this because I expect that someone will be interested in my story, and while most may doubt it or regard it a work of fiction, I know that it happened. I will share my experience to the best of my ability, but it will be difficult to fully capture in words. Before we get there, however, I need to explain a bit of context. The evening of the encounter was noticeably dark as the night sky lacked any trace of the moon, and so the only illumination was that which was bestowed by the light of the stars. I awoke in my secluded spot to the faint sound of a soft, enchanting violin tune, a beautiful, melancholy song that enticed me as no classical piece ever had. I was certain that I had never heard this melody before, as I no doubt would have remembered such a sad, sweet refrain. So I followed the sound, though this was against my better judgment, as the music came from the direction opposite the trail, and it was unlikely I'd be able to find my way back in the dark. The walk was much farther than I had expected, and I had no idea where I was going. The darkness harshly obscured the world around me. The light of my flashlight was quite dim, and I had to aim it just in front of my feet so I didn't trip over anything. Thus, as I kept going, I knew I was becoming more and more hopelessly lost. But I would not surrender my pursuit of the musician producing such a song, for it was surely the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in all my life. As I neared the source of the music, I came to an ancient headstone, and I noticed the trees thinned out a bit in the nearby area and were strangely withered. The effigy on the headstone was long worn, the name of its subject lost to time. I shined my weak light about the area and found the place to be scattered with dozens, perhaps even hundreds of decrepit graves, and then my light beam caught a distant silhouette. Because of the darkness, I could hardly make out any features aside from a vaguely feminine, bony physique and a dark hooded cloak. I nearly screamed, I was so startled. And then I realized that I'd found the mystic magician I had been searching for performing beneath the starlight in a forgotten graveyard with no audience but the sleeping dead. I listened to the figure's graceful playing until the song had finished, and by the end of it, I was in tears from its sorrow, and I applauded vigorously. "That was amazing," I said. "Who are you?" The figure took a moment to respond. "A musician," it replied coyly with a voice too high to definitely be a man's but too low to definitely be a woman's, and so I could not discern its gender. "Are you just playing for yourself, or are there others here?" I wondered. "There are others here," it said assuringly. "Many others. Can't you see them?" I looked about, but saw and heard no one but us two. I became a bit unsettled. "See who? There's only graves." "Ah, but the dead make for the best and most attentive audience, as they can do naught but lie and listen." And then it asked me if I enjoyed the tune, and I said that I did. And then it asked if I would like to hear another, and I said that I would. And then it began to play a song just as sweet and almost as sad, but also entirely unique. It was so different from the previous song, in fact, that I felt its origins were rooted in a different culture altogether, though I could make no guess as to the cultural heritage of either piece. While I don't claim to be an expert on the music of foreign cultures, they sounded so different from any piece I had yet heard that I couldn't so much as estimate a continent of origin. The musician moved the bow with calm, broad strokes whilst its other slender hand danced upon the frets with a fervor, and it swayed and pirouetted enthusiastically in the breeze as it played, and it was perhaps the most graceful performance I had ever seen. I was lost in the music, captivated by its gentle sound, and I gazed at the musician, my eyes locked as though I were hypnotized. Just then, 2 deer approached the outskirts of the cemetery and watched the musician observantly, for they too had come to hear it play. And then, after what seemed to be but a moment, the song ended, and I begged the musician to play another, and it agreed, and it began playing a strange sort of waltz. This was, as of yet, the most terrestrial song it had played, for it had some familiar structure at least, though it was still somehow so thoroughly distinct. As it played, the musician began to dance some peculiar yet beautiful version of the waltz, pivoting and moving all about as it played, and I could not help but join in the dance myself. I emulated the musician's steps as best I could, for the dance was so especially enchanting that I was determined to learn it, but the musician was so graceful in its frolic that I appeared clumsy and uncoordinated by comparison. Suddenly the night grew colder and the wind picked up, and it was as though the spirits of the dead had risen to dance beside us. A few times, I thought I saw shadowy figures dancing in on the edge of my vision, but when I looked to where I believed I had seen them, they were no longer there. I attributed the phenomenon to my eyes playing tricks, perhaps a result of my sleeplessness, but I was unsettled nonetheless. However, I found that the more I danced, the less unsettled I was and the happier I became, and I became so elated that my heart began to flutter and my breath grew short. I soon realized that even if I were dancing with the dead, there would be no cause for alarm, for they didn't wish me any harm. We were appreciating the same music. We were members of the same audience. And then the piece began to wind down and the wind slowed again to a subtle breeze, and I applauded passionately as the musician took its bow. When I approached the musician, it requested that I might keep some distance, explaining that it was horribly disfigured and hated to be spied in any resemblance of detail, but told me that I could come close enough for the 2 of us to reasonably converse without having to yell. I made clear my adoration for the musician's music, and it told me that it was glad for that, and that it was happy to perform for me, as it claimed rarely to have had a breathing audience. Again I grew unnerved, but I tried my best to hide it. The musician was surprisingly charismatic, and I gradually became comfortable once again, though I still had no sense of its gender. It played a soft, subtle tune as we talked, and I would shout out songs and it would play its own version of each, improving upon them significantly, and it seemed to know any song that I could suggest, regardless of genre or popularity. I asked it where it learned its craft, and it told me that it was self-taught, and then I asked for how long it had been playing, and it said that it had been playing forever. It asked me if I would like to hear a story, and I said that I did. And then it told me to sit, so I sat upon the grass-patched earth and listened devotedly, while it told the greatest tale I had ever heard. It told the story so compellingly and so adeptly that I grew quite attached to the characters, and for the duration of the tale, he was as a puppet master holding the strings to my emotions. At times, it had to halt the telling because I was laughing so hysterically that I began to tire up and could not hear what it was saying, and at other times I was tearing up because I was so horribly shaken by the sorrow. When the tale came to a close, I again was in tears, for the ending was so despondent and I did not want the story to be over or to end in this manner. I asked why the ending had to be so full of despair, and it said that a sorrowful ending evokes more emotion and more thought, and that it leaves behind a greater impression, and that a happy ending could hardly convey moral lessons as strongly as a mournful one. I asked where it had heard such a story, and it told me that it weaved the tale as it went. It took great pride in its storytelling prowess and boasted a silver tongue with which I could not disagree. I begged the musician to tell me another story, and it agreed, but said that it only had time for one more, as dawn would soon come, and it had to be gone before then. which saddened me greatly, but I nodded in tacit agreement. The second tale was even better than the first. It was told so vividly that I could almost see what the musician was describing. I was so enchanted by its words that I became lost in them, and while I listened, nothing around us existed. I thought not of the trees or the stars, or the dilapidated and broken headstones around us. My mind focused only on his words and the story they formed. The second tale was of a painter and sculptor who revered nothing above the arts. He never felt inclined towards organized religion, as his small acts of creation were his means of communing with the divine. Most in his country, however, believed art to be decadent and pointless, and so paid the painter's works no respect or patronage. The painter, however, refused to give up his passion, even if it meant going hungry some nights, for the arts were all that made him happy. One by one, his countrymen began to shun the arts as a whole, for they were simple folk, and when they did, they gradually changed into beasts of pure instinct, lacking all logic and emotion, and this went on until the painter was the last man to hold tight his humanity. As all his countrymen had become mindless creatures, the painter became excruciatingly lonely and was overcome with a horrible, maddening depression. He pondered for months whether or not he should surrender his passion and join the herd, debating endlessly over which was worse, to be without companionship or without his art. The painter became so shaken by his solitude that he began to question his beliefs, his passions, and his identity. Eventually, the painter grew so desperate for fellowship that he endeavored to surrender his creativity and metamorphose into a beast. But no matter how much he struggled, he could not become one of the herd, for he could not give up his creativity. It was too integral a part of him. At first, he wallowed in despair and self-pity for his aloneness, but soon he came to realize that being the last man in the world meant that the world was his, and he learned not only to endure solitude, but to revel in it. He traveled the land for many years until he one day learned to change the beasts back into people, except they must have wanted to become human again, to regain their humanity, and most would rather laze in the shade than live in the sunlight. Nevertheless, he restores the gift of creativity in some, and he finally gains the companionship he so desired, though now he knows that he can be happy alone, so long as he has his creativity. Then I asked the musician, "Why do the people become beasts when they give up art?" And the musician said, "Art is divine, for creation is a godly power, and only those in God's own bloodline bear the privilege." I noticed the sky was beginning to lighten from a black to a dark navy blue, and the musician saw it too and said that it had to go, and I was so upset that I began to weep, for I could not bear the idea of never hearing this musician's sweet music again, nor could I go without more of its tales. I begged it not to go. Regretfully, it said that it must go, but that one day I would see it again. It said that I would not recognize its face, but that I would know it, and on that day I would hear its enchanting music and its fantastic stories once more. I asked the musician when this reunion would be, and it said that it could not tell me, but that it would not occur for many years. The musician agreed to play one last song before we parted ways. A lullaby, and it was sweeter and more relaxing than any my mother had sung to me when I was young. I was immediately captivated and my eyelids quickly grew heavy. I dropped to the dirt and sat listening to the musician's bewitching finale. I'm not certain how much of the song I was awake for, or when I fell asleep, but I woke up comfortably in my usual favorite spot, feeling incredibly well rested and calm, birds chirping around me as I slowly pried open my eyes. For a while I was convinced that the entire event was nothing but an extraordinarily vivid dream, especially because I was never able to locate the graveyard again no matter how meticulously I searched, but I was burdened by doubt in the back of my mind. Could such beautiful, unique music have come from my own mind? It seemed impossible. I remembered each song and the whole encounter so clearly, and yet the experience was so surreal. A few months after the encounter with the musician, my aunt became ill with meningitis and was in a coma for a week, and for a short while she lacked any brain activity, and for an even shorter while her heart stopped. The hospital managed to pull her from the brink of the abyss and my aunt survived, despite overwhelming odds against her. Now, my aunt is quite religious, and she claims that she was dead for a time and she has described what she saw. Most of my family is skeptical and dismissive regarding her stories as nothing but a dream or a call for attention, which was not above my aunt, but I was nonetheless interested, so I begged her to tell me all she could. She told me she spoke to someone. She wasn't certain as to who it was, nor did she remember any details. She just knew that this figure had come to lead her to whatever afterlife was in store for her, be it heaven or hell or something different altogether. She remembered no defining traits, but she did remember the figure telling her that it was not yet her time. It told her that now their time together would be brief, but that it would see her again when her time came. I spent much of my time with my aunt over the next few days. I kept asking her if she remembered anything more about her near-death experience, and we discussed for hours its potential meaning, either as a reality or as a dream. Sometimes I would simply read by her bedside and keep her company while she read a book of her own. She had a habit of humming idly to herself as she read, and every day since she awoke from her coma, my aunt hummed the same idle tune to herself. It sounded so familiar, but I couldn't quite figure out what song it was, and it frustrated me terribly. I asked her the name of the song, and she said she wasn't sure. She claimed that she must have heard it in a dream, and then I realized where I'd heard the tune before. I'd heard it in a graveyard, performed by a mysterious and faceless musician late at night, and I knew for certain that my encounter had not simply been a dream.
I remember having a dream where I walked down a river with a hooded figure. I knew that it was death and was wearing a dark robe myself. It told me to pull the fish from the river, and so I did. The fish didn't struggle as I grabbed it from its fin. Its scales fell off and nothing but bones was left. However, the flesh didn't stop at the fish. It continued up my arm until my hand itself was bone. It sort of spooked me and got me off my bed. I woke up to find my 6-year-old Oscar dead in its aquarium. I don't know. I've always had strange dreams when people or animals close to me die.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.